Hey, what's up? I hope you're missing history class as much as I am. Man, I miss history class. Just be able to discuss these things instead of just talking at a screen. I'm sure I feel sorry for you people trying to listen to me on these videos. I'm doing my best to make them interesting. I'm sorry if they're boring. Maybe you use them to put you to sleep at night, but I'm doing my best. So let's talk about the Battle of Iwo Jima today. So I kind of introduced it in yesterday's video, so we're going to get into it a bit more today. So looking at our World War II map, see Iwo Jima, part of these little chain of volcanic islands, several hundred miles away from Japan, but hundreds of miles closer to Japan than Saipan, where our bombers were launching from. And so you remember this from yesterday. Our bombers were flying to Japan from Saipan. They're trying to drop bombs at 30,000 feet. There's winds over 100 knots from the jet winds. Our bombs were not hitting targets as they were supposed to, and so we need a new plan of attack. Our fighters couldn't help, so we decided to take Iwo Jima because it was the biggest island in the area that had room for airstrips that we could launch our B-29s from. And so we knew that was the next step. So here's an aerial view of Iwo Jima. It's just a small island, two miles wide by 4 or 5 miles long, dominated on the one side by this volcano, Mount Suribachi. And then you can see the crisscross of a couple of airstrips here in the middle, and then another airstrip here. And so this was it, this volcanic island filled with all kinds of crags and crevices and caves and volcanic ash. That was the target. So this was a 36-day battle from February 19 to March 26, 1945. So make sure you know that date, February 19. That was D-Day for Iwo Jima. And you can see how the battle progressed here, landing on these beaches here. This is Mount Suribachi. And then end of day one, then the airfields, and then kind of all the way till the very last part of the mission. So it says here, you can see that objective again. We're looking for a place for our B-29s to have big enough airfields for them to land to better bomb Japan. And we have Iwo Jima had radar installations that was detecting our planes on the way to Japan. So we wanted to take those out. We wanted a place for our P-51 Mustang fighters to be able to take off from to escort our bombers. And as you see here, it says nearly 2,400 B-29s had made unscheduled landings on Iwo Jima by end of World War II. Now, we took this over in March of 1945. The war ended in August of 1945. So in that short time, having Iwo Jima saved over 2,000 B-29s and their crews. So that's significant. Every B-29 had at least 10 guys on it. So roughly you're talking about 20,000 plus men that were potentially saved because we had Iwo Jima. We also needed Iwo Jima to launch against our next target in the Pacific, which was Okinawa. So you could see that in the map here, April to June of 1945, Okinawa. So, and there was this idea that we were going to make Iwo Jima into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. So it's like Iwo Jima, instead of having aircraft carriers trying to deliver planes to attack Japan, we had Iwo Jima, which would become a permanent unsinkable aircraft carrier with which we could launch these B-29s, etc., against Japan. So that's kind of why we wanted Iwo Jima. There's one problem with this picture, by the way. that I wanted to mention. Down here it says casualties, and I mentioned this on previous videos. So casualties means dead and wounded, dead and wounded. And so we had 6,821 men die on Iwo Jima, and the Japanese had over 18,000. So this is really to say deaths, not casualties, because we had over 20,000 casualties. But that's casualties is dead and wounded. Okay, let's move on. So this was a neat little graphic that was done in the Marine Times, the Marine Corps Times. And I'm sorry it's zoomed out. It's hard to get a picture on the PowerPoint. But you can see kind of what the defense system was like. So Tadamichi Kuribayashi was the Japanese commander who knew he was going to die in Iwo Jima. He knew it was his, that he was sentenced to death there with all of his men. And their goal was to hold out as long as he could to delay the bombing of Tokyo. And so he was heroic. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It takes a bravery and courage to know that you're going to die. And so his goal with the time that he had in Iwo Jima, which was significant, to build the best defenses with what he had. And his goal was that every Japanese soldier would kill 10 Americans. And that was the only hope they had. But you see here this elaborate defensive network where their guns were, like here you have this defense gun and only the barrels sticking out from underneath this concrete bunker. Their machine guns. The only thing that was really exposed was their anti-aircraft guns, because you can't have an anti-aircraft gun in a cave because it's got to shoot planes. But all their other guns facing the beaches where we were going to land, their mortars, they had these giant 320 millimeter spigot mortars. We called different names, but terrifying. We'll talk about them more in a minute. But you can see, like, the Japanese, he planned on having almost 20 miles of underground tunnels. Now, I told you that the island itself was only 2 miles by 5 miles, but he wanted to have almost 20 miles of underground tunneling going to caves and bunkers. They had hospitals, their mess hall, their whole entire lives were spent underground on Iwo Jima. There's no Japanese bunker or military buildings above ground because they knew the Americans would just blow them to pieces with planes and ships. So everything was underground. The ammo was stored underground, the water, the food, the hospital, everything was underground. And they built this elaborate system of tunnels and caves crisscrossing the entire island, which made things particularly difficult because if you, like, maybe you knock out a gun position as an American, so you knock out the gun position, but you're unaware that there's an underground tunnel that leads to it. And so the next day, maybe other men are walking by that same machine gun position. They think it's knocked out, and next thing you know, the Japanese are back in there because they just came up through the tunnels, different Japanese, to take that gun position. So we had to root them out, cave by cave, cavern by cavern, tunnel by tunnel, spider hole by spider hole. And that's what made this an unprecedented battle, right? So the Marine Corps looks at, in their history, they look at 3 battles specifically in the 20th century as signature battles for the Marine Corps. Battle of Wood in World War I, Iwo Jima in World War II, and then the Chosin Reservoir in the Korean War. And so this battle, Iwo Jima, you can see how it was so unique. We have a determined enemy in the Japanese, maybe no more determined enemy in human history. They spend months and months, lots of human labor, thousands of Japanese men just building, digging, creating the most defensible positions possible in this small island. Just an amazing feat. And then they would hide these things. So we see this kind of a overview here, but the Japanese planted, we see some vegetation here. They would plant trees and shrub bushes and grasses, etc., on top of their positions to mask them, to camouflage them. So you wouldn't see it. It's not like you saw fresh dirt and you're like, oh, there's a position there. It was like the landscape was all looked the same. And so they were masters at hiding their positions from the Americans. All right, so here's that 320 millimeter spigot mortar. So this is actually the projectile. Unlike a typical mortar where you drop the little projectile down a tube, this thing actually fit on top of the tube, and then it would be launched. And this thing weighed 675 pounds and could be launched almost a mile. And it would create this massive crater. And they weren't very accurate. The Japanese called this a terror weapon or a psychological warfare weapon, where they would launch this thing and it made this terrible screeching noise and freaked all the Americans out. You never knew where the thing was going to hit, and then just blow this massive crater in the ground. And so they had these things at Iwo Jima. So here's Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the mastermind behind the Japanese defenses. Here's another thing that they did for defense. They had a bunch of tanks, the Japanese did, but they didn't use them to be mobile. They immobilized them, they parked them, and then they created bunkers around them so that the tank turret could be used as a defensive weapon, but there was no offensive movement by the tanks or by any of the Japanese, really. There was no banzai charges, etc. It was all to be defensive positions, make the Americans root us out, kill as many Americans as possible. That was the Japanese way of things in 1945. So here's a picture of D-Day, February 19, 1945. We've got all these American landing craft heading towards the beaches in a coordinated assault, wave upon wave, to land. Now the Japanese, you can see Mount Suribachi in the distance there, and what the Japanese are going to do is they have every piece of this beach, they have pinpointed with artillery and mortars. So the goal there was, like, when you have these artillery and mortar positions the Japanese did, it's inefficient to try to move them at target. So it's not like, oh, we see some Americans over there, move the artillery to shoot over there. Oh, there's some more over here, move the artillery to shoot over here. That was wildly inefficient. So what they would do is they would pre-register, it was called. They would have a spot on the beach, like these artillery and mortar attack these positions on the beach. And so they would just continually launch shells at that same position whenever they saw Americans moving into that position. So what Kuribayashi did here was the Americans were allowed to land on the beach with minimal resistance. And then once thousands of Americans were on the beach and all congregated together in this volcanic ash sand mixture that was impossible to dig in or have any protection, then they rained down artillery and mortar and machine gun fire on top of the Americans. It's more like a trap than what the Germans had done on the Atlantic Wall. So here's some Americans after the Marines after they landed. You can see there's just not much cover on top of this sand. It's like, trying to, all these Japanese ordnances are falling on top of you, but you can't escape because you've got nowhere to hide. It's just all super loose volcanic ash and sand. I'm gonna share a different look here a second. So this is from a book, a great book on Iwo Jima, by Eric Hamill. And sorry, it's kind of zoomed in. So just looking at some of these defenses the Japanese had. So see there kind of the terrain. And then here's a picture here. These were cisterns that the Japanese were making for water, because obviously there's no water was a huge problem for the Japanese. Here's an example of one of their bunkers. So here's an entrance, obviously. And they, all kinds of stones and rocks and dirt on top of it. So even if this thing got hit by an aerial bomb or a bomb from a U.S. or a projectile from a U.S. ship, the chances, there's just very little chance you would destroy this thing. Here's a bigger bunker. says that it's a tunnel entrance to a complex of hospital and communication bunkers deep underneath the surface. But look at, so it's really protected inside the terrain, and it's got all these stones and earth on top of it and trees around it. And yeah, even if you knew where it was, you couldn't hit the thing. And so the Americans had to go inside these things with flamethrowers, etc., because there's just no way else to attack them. Here's another look at an underground tunnel hewn right through the stone. And then here's another look at the tunneling. So the Japanese lived here in these tunnels and bunkers underneath the surface to protect them from American attack. So a bit back to the PowerPoint here. Right, so one of the tools that we had to use to oust these Japanese from these bunkers, pillboxes, spider holes, etc., was the flamethrower. So our flamethrower at the time shot this substance called napalm, which was a gel gasoline-like substance that would stick on things and burn intensely hot. Very terrible to die being hit by a flamethrower. The man at the right was the Medal of Honor winner that we looked the video that you looked at yesterday, Hershel, or Woody they called him. And so his heroics going after Japanese position after Japanese position, getting multiple flamethrower tanks to attack. So here's some a picture from Iwo Jima, where you see a couple of our flamethrower Marines shooting out this napalm. Could go up to 50 yards into the Japanese positions, but this was one of the ways that we knocked them out. We also had flamethrower tanks like this one, and these things were awesome. However, we didn't have enough of them and couldn't get them to all the places we need to get them to because of the terrain, etc., fighting against the Japanese on Iwo Jima. Yeah, so Chester Nimitz, the man in charge of the whole Pacific operation, said that at Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. And there were 27 Medal of Honor recipients from the fighting on Iwo Jima, more than any other battle in American history. You see this, the asterisk ones are the ones that received the medal because they died after they were dead. They died in battle. You see George Wallen's name, so we read about him. So this is just a little video here. This is actually at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. I was there a couple of years ago, and I took this little video, so I'll play it.
We're in the World War II Museum in New Orleans. You can see the airplanes. But this is a Medal of Honor wall. So I believe every Medal of Honor recipient from World War II who they have a picture of is on this wall. And then there's a computer database where you can look up every Medal of Honor and their citation.
All right, so not a great video, obviously, but it was really impressive to me. I was kind of in a hurry. We were going to the USS Tang exhibit, which is pretty awesome at the World War II Museum. And you can see that this whole building here, this is one of 5 buildings, and they have all these planes and bombers and fighters and stuff. And I just noticed this Medal of Honor wall where they have every Medal of Honor winner from World War II up on that wall. And I was just overwhelmed. I mean, these men and the sacrifice. And then, like I said, there's a computer there. You could look up any of their citations and stories. And I could have spent all day there, but yeah, we had a schedule to keep. But I hope to get back. And I hope you have at some point can visit the museum. It's well worth. It's really expensive, but it's worth it. So just look at some of these Medal of Honor winners. William Walsh. So he's going through machine gun fire against the Japanese entrenched against him, and through hand grenades, etc. He led his men. Despite his own casualty losses, an overwhelming advantage held by the Japanese in superior numbers and dominant position, he gained the ridge's top, only to be subjected to an intense barrage of hand grenades thrown by the remaining Japanese, staging a suicidal last stand. When one of the grenades fell in the midst of his surviving men huddled together in a trench, Gunnery Sergeant Walsh, in a final valiant act of complete self-sacrifice, instantly threw himself upon the deadly bomb, taking the full force into his body, giving his life for his men and for his country. So this is what you expect out of an officer, right? To sacrifice his life for his men. And there were many examples of these Medal of Honor winners that received the medal because they did something like this, dove on grenades or something to save other men. Here's another corpsman who received the Medal of Honor, like George Wallen. So this man, he, just like George Wallen, he was hit by shrapnel. He was supposed to evacuate himself back to an aid station, but instead of staying at the aid station, he went back out, returned to his company, doing in the midst of a savage counterattack by the Japanese. He went all the way to the front lines under mortar and sniper fire to aid a Marine in a shell hole. Unmindful of his own danger, he continued to administer blood plasma to the patient. And then the Japanese started hurling grenades at him, because the Japanese, as you remember, didn't really respect our corpsmen. They tried to kill him. And so he threw back many grenades. It says 8. 8 grenades were hurled in his position. He hurled 9 of them were put into his position. He got 8 of them thrown back out over a course of time before the 9th one exploded in his hand and killed him. And so he could have evacuated. He was wounded. He could have stayed in the aid station and said, you know what, I did my part. I got wounded. I need to take care of myself. Instead, he went back out against orders, saved men, and then ended up dying from a grenade. This man, he's a private, so he's not an officer, and yet you can see this kind of Marine training, where even if you weren't an officer, you still knew how to take charge of a situation. So it says here, he led a bold charge against an enemy gun installation, and which had held up the advance for several days. As additional Jap troops opened fire from concealed tunnels and caves, he quickly scaled the rocks leading to the attacking guns, surprised the enemy with furious one-man assault. Although severely wounded in the encounter, deliberately crawled back to a squad position where he steadfastly refused evacuation, persistently directing heavy machine gun and rocket barrages on the Japanese cave entrances. Undaunted by merciless rain of hostile fire, he gallantly disregarded his own painful wounds to aid casualties, carrying 3 wounded squad members to safety behind the lines and returning to continue the battle with renewed determination until ordered to retire for medical treatment. So here's this guy, he's a private, he's not an officer, but yet he's leading the charge against this gun installation, and he gets wounded. He refused to evacuate himself. He carries 3 of his wounded buddies to safety, saving their lives, and he's a hero. This man, Joseph Julian, another Medal of Honor winner, says he executed a one-man assault on a pillbox. He hurled deadly demolition and white phosphorus grenades, killing 2 of the enemy, driving the remaining 5 into a trench. Seizing a discarded rifle, he jumped into the trench and killed the 5 before they could escape. He obtained more explosives and got it with another Marine, again charged hostile fortifications, knocked out 2 more cave positions. He launched a bazooka attack unassisted, firing 4 rounds into a pillbox, destroying it, but then he was killed by enemy fire. So just think about, I mean, we're reading words, but if you try to imagine what this has been like, he assaults a pillbox by himself. He He's throwing grenades. He kills 2 of the enemy. He sees 5 more. He grabs a gun that was there, shoots those 5, gets a bazooka, and another Marine goes and takes out another pillbox before he's killed. But that type of disregard, right? This dedication to duty that he had. And here's just one more. First Lieutenant Jack Loomis, a giant in battle, they called him. So it says, fought for several days and nights, slowly advanced his platoon against an enemy, deeply entrenched. Suddenly halted by a terrific concentration of hostile fire, he unhesitantly moved forward of his front lines in an effort to neutralize the Japanese. Although knocked to the ground when an enemy grenade exploded close by, he immediately recovered himself and again moving forward despite the intensified barrage, quickly located and attacked and destroyed the occupied emplacement. Instantly taking under fire by the garrison of supported pillbox and further assailed by the slashing fury of hostile fire, he fell under the impact of a second grenade, but despite having wounds in his shoulder, continued his assault, charged the second pillbox, annihilating it. Then he returned to his position, platoon position. He traversed lines under fire, encouraged his men to advance against other Japanese emplacements. Then, under barrage, he again moved into the open, rushed a third heavily fortified installation, killed the defending troops. Determined to crush all resistance, he has led his men indomitably, personally attacking foxholes and spider traps with his carbine, and systematically reducing the fanatic opposition until he stepped in a landmine and sustained fatal wounds. So here's another, giant of a man in valor, where he's fighting, taking out the enemies, getting hit by grenades. He could have evacuated himself. He could have pulled himself out, but instead, no, he's going to lead his men. And then he ended up stepping on a landmine. So each of these men, extremely courageous, and this is what contributed to the Marine victory. So we're going to look at the last piece of Iwo Jima tomorrow, the flag raising, which happened early in the battle, but is a whole nother story. So we'll stop here from today, and hopefully you learned a thing or two about Iwo Jima and the men who fought there.